It started just after midnight, on the first frostbite wind of November, when the chimneys of the long-abandoned St. Arnaud refuge began to smoke again for the first time in over 2 decades. Locals in the village of Elmbrook would later recall hearing no explosion, no thunderclap of collapse, just a strange low hum in the air, like breath held too long by something old. By the time the blaze reached its peak, it moved as though it had memory, lashing at the rotted wooden beams, pulling down the eaves like it knew what needed to vanish. The fire brigade arrived late and left early, muttering about faulty insulation and lightning, though the skies had been dry. They didn't speak of the smell that lingered for days, less of smoke, more of burnt leather and something sweetly putrid like syrup poured over bone. When the ashes cooled, investigators stepped carefully across the ruins. Though most wanted to leave, there was something about the land itself that now felt cursed. What remained of the main chapel had collapsed inward, its crucifix half sunk in the soot, warped and melted at the arms. In the eastern wing's rubble, near what had once been the dormitory quarters, a human form was found, twisted backward, scorched to black, as if trying to shield something beneath the torso. At first, they thought it was a caretaker caught in a squatter's fire, a sad accident to be buried quietly. But then came the object clutched in the body's arms, welded to the skin by heat and refusal. A thick leather ledger, the spine split, the pages fused but legible at their edges. The name etched on the inside cover, Father Emil Voss, had not been spoken aloud in Elmbrook in over 30 years. The ledger wasn't a journal. It wasn't a confession or a financial record. It was a list, a simple methodical register of 33 names, first names only, each followed by a date and a single Latin phrase. The names were unfamiliar. None matched orphanage enrollment records, census lists, or baptismal registries. The paper had yellowed unevenly, as if some pages had been touched more than others, turned over again and again like a liturgy. One investigator, a war veteran and devout Catholic, read the Latin phrases and refused to ever return to the site. He claimed the entries weren't prayers. They were instructions, ritual directives written in a theological cipher, part liturgical, part anatomical. Phrases like purge through confinement and mirror until silent offered no comfort. Authorities dismissed it all as hysteria, insisted the names were aliases or imaginary. The list was quietly archived and marked no immediate relevance. It never made the newspapers, but locals knew. They remembered the old stories. The whispers about the children who had gone to Saint Arnaud and were never seen again. They'd been told those kids were adopted quickly, sent to families out of state, lost in the system. No one had questioned it back then. No one wanted to. The refuge had once been a symbol of grace, an orphanage run by clergy, a haven for war-wounded children after the fires of the Civil War. Father Voss had been beloved by many, especially those who never looked too closely. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, who gave caramel candies to girls who cried, who made the choir sing louder to drown out the thunder during storms. He wrote letters to donors in Chicago about the holiness of healing. He was a man who said all the right words, and somehow behind that smile he'd been making lists. As cleanup crews sifted through the charred bones of the past, they discovered other things, too small to catalog formally. Bits of wax sealed in crucifix shapes, metal rings nailed into the floor beneath the bedposts, a section of basement wall that had been hollowed out and filled with tightly packed feathers. No explanations were offered. No press release was made. The church issued a brief statement offering condolences for the tragic fire that claimed the life of an unknown squatter. They never mentioned the ledger. They never mentioned the name Emil Voss. But one photograph did circulate, a black and white image taken by a young firefighter before the body was removed. It showed the corpse curled like a question mark with the book still pressed to the chest. What disturbed most viewers wasn't the posture or the burns. It was the fact that, in the background, carved faintly into a soot-streaked wall, were the outlines of 33 child-sized hands, some fingers splayed, some curled into fists, all reaching upward. No one saw flames when the fire began, only that low, impossible hum. And no one knew why the body had stayed behind in a place everyone had long since forgotten. But it hadn't died running. It had died holding something tight. And what it held was a list of names the world had chosen not to remember, and the fire, it seemed, had come only to make sure they never would. The cleanup began 2 days after the fire, though no one wanted to be first to step across the blackened threshold. By then the soot had settled like ash-colored snow, soft and quiet, hiding what it couldn't erase. Most of the old structure had collapsed inward, but the stone bones of the chapel still jutted from the earth like cracked ribs. Beneath the chapel, down a narrow stairwell that miraculously survived the blaze, workers discovered a sealed door bolted from the inside. When they forced it open, what emerged wasn't smoke but cold, heavy and still like air trapped in a grave. The crypt had not burned. It had been waiting. The walls were lined with prayer alcoves, but none held scripture. Instead, there were dozens of glass jars filled with pale dust and small curled fragments. At first, they looked like remnants of wood or burnt paper. But upon closer examination, one man realized the truth. Each jar contained slivers of human bone, shaved and shaped, some bearing hand-carved initials no larger than a fingernail. Ribs, knuckles, vertebrae, smoothed down, catalogued, organized by size. Many were painted with faint red markings that weren't decorative but anatomical, as if used for study or ritual placement. They had not been collected in reverence. They had been stored like ingredients. Further in, a long table stood beneath the altar, covered in melted wax that had run thick and crusted over parchment sheets. The papers had once been hymns, but someone had reinscribed them layer by layer, turning each line of praise into cryptic diagrams, hybrids of Christian iconography and older, stranger sigils. Crosses bent into circles, eyes encased in thorns, triangles resting atop inverted chalices. At the center of it all stood a grotesque wax seal, still mostly intact, bearing a twin-headed lamb. One face smiling, the other screaming. It had been pressed over human hair. Against the far wall stood a chair that did not belong in a chapel. Constructed of iron, bolted to the floor, its arms extended unusually far apart, like they were meant to stretch rather than comfort. Straps of decayed leather dangled from the armrests and neck support. Etched along the inner seat was a repeating Latin phrase that loosely translated to submission through stillness. A rusted crank system suggested the chair could tilt back and lock into place. But the most disturbing feature was the small compartment at the base, where investigators found what remained of a burned ceramic bowl. still holding traces of ash, bone dust, and dried blood. This had not been a chair for punishment. It had been a throne for transformation. Everything in the crypt had been designed not just to contain, but to control. The restraints, the carvings, the sealed jars, all bore the fingerprints of obsession, of someone who believed they were performing sacred work. The space radiated something ancient, not in age but in intent, as if the man who built it had found his own religion within the cracks of the one he served. No one could explain how the fire had left the crypt untouched, how smoke had not even blackened the ceiling. It was as if the flames knew better than to touch what waited below. And yet the ashes above had pointed here. They had led to the secrets buried beneath the chapel floor. Secrets that now breathed again in silence. The man with the list had not just remembered names, he had preserved them, carved them into bone, melted them into wax, and strapped them into steel. Whatever had happened in that crypt had not been about punishment or mercy. It had been about permanence, and the fire, whatever its origin, had failed to bury what the walls still remembered. In the autumn of 1912, nearly a year after the fire, a retired postmaster named Alton Greaves quietly delivered a brittle, yellowed envelope to the county archivist's office. He claimed it had turned up while sorting through the unclaimed contents of a storage unit he'd inherited from his late brother. A trunk full of ledgers, canceled stamps, and mold-softened correspondence no one ever came back for. At first, the envelope didn't seem unusual. It bore no address, no return name, only a single word written across the front in faded pencil. Please. But inside was something different, something trembling even after all these years. A letter written by hand in a child's broken scrawl, the lines uneven, some letters smudged with what appeared to be tears. It was dated January 1873. The name signed at the bottom was Mary Beth E. Waller, age 11. The letter began with obedience. Mary Beth had written to Father Emil Voss, not in accusation but in reverence. She called him kind. She said she still remembered the plum jam he gave her the first week and the story he told about the bird who forgave the stone that broke its wing. She said she had been good, always quiet, always folding her hands the way he liked. But the tone changed by the second page. Her sentences frayed, veered into panic. She said something strange was happening at night. Children were taken from their beds after evening prayers and didn't come back for breakfast. They were told the missing ones had gone to families, but no wagons ever came. No one heard horses. The blankets were left behind. Sometimes, she wrote, the bed still held warmth when morning came. She described strange things. Walls that sometimes echoed with voices that didn't match any of the children. Scratches behind the chapel bookshelf. A locked room that smelled like vinegar and old rust, where Sister Imelda kept the key on a rosary that never left her wrist. She said she tried to tell one of the nuns once, but was made to kneel outside in the snow without shoes for 2 hours. After that, her nose bled for days. Then came the part no one wanted to read twice. Mary Beth wrote that she had seen what they called quiet punishments. She had hidden under the laundry bin one night and watched through the slats as a boy named Caleb was strapped to a wooden board and lowered into the floor beneath the chapel. She didn't know how far he went. She only remembered the screaming, and how, when they pulled the board back up, it came back empty. She ended the letter with something worse than fear. She ended it with guilt. She said she had heard her name whispered from the hallway outside her room 3 nights in a row, and that she had taken to tying her wrists to the bed frame so she wouldn't wander in her sleep. She said she knew she was next, and then she begged Father Emil to forgive her in advance for anything she might do to resist. The final line was written so faintly it was nearly invisible. I don't want to forget my name. There was no envelope because it had never been mailed. Whether she left it behind on purpose or someone else had taken it before she could send it, no one could say. Mary Beth Waller was not listed among the known deaths at St. Arnaud. She wasn't listed at all. Her name was the first one in the scorched ledger, dated February 2nd, 1873, followed by the phrase, Silentia per lumen, silence through light. And though her letter never reached the world while she lived, it survived the fire, as if even the flames had known it wasn't meant to be destroyed. In the early spring of 1871, the carriage wheels of Father Emil Voss creaked onto the frost-bitten soil of Elmbrook like something fated. The village, still bruised by the aftermath of war and famine, welcomed him with relief and reverence. He came from Prussia, fluent in 3 languages, with a voice like warm broth and eyes that never blinked too long. The congregation at St. Arnaud felt chosen. His sermons were short, his hands steady, his smile generous in just the right doses. He took over the refuge from a dying cleric whose records were sparse and whose memory was fading. Within weeks, Voss had reorganized the sleeping quarters, rewritten the chapel schedule, and posted new rules on the orphanage door. Ones that promised discipline, reflection, and the cultivation of divine silence. The children were told he was kind, and at first he was. He walked the halls with pockets full of toffees, knelt beside boys with fevers, and praised those who folded their hands just right. He replaced the broken mirror in the girls' dormitory with a polished copper sheet, claiming glass was a vanity. He banned birthdays, saying God did not count days, only deeds. Then came the isolation doctrine. It was introduced gradually under the guise of spiritual obedience. 1 day of silence a week, then 2. Entire weekends without speaking unless spoken to. Children were instructed to listen to the voice of stillness, to sit motionless for hours at a time, blindfolded with white cloths and told to reflect inward. If they shifted, they were tapped with a wooden pointer. If they cried, they were told it meant the soul was resisting. Over time, even the crying stopped. The townspeople noticed the orphans became quieter, more orderly, more obedient than any generation before. They mistook it for peace. Voss began to hold closed-door sessions with certain children. Private reflections, he called them. Always at night. Always in the small chamber behind the pulpit where the candles never seemed to burn out. Those children would return pale, sometimes limping, but always more compliant. He explained it away as penance for stolen food or bad dreams. No one questioned him. He'd been educated in Würzburg. He quoted scripture from memory and smiled like a man who had seen both suffering and salvation and could hold them in balance. People believed in his methods because his methods worked, on the surface. The first child to vanish was a boy named Elias. He was 9, red-haired, fond of whittling. Voss said he had been adopted by a relative in Illinois. No one saw the wagon come or go. Then a girl disappeared, Adeline, small for her age, with a stutter. Voss claimed she'd run away to find her brother who'd fought in the war. He prayed for her during Sunday Mass. One by one, the names dwindled, and yet no formal records of adoption were filed, no letters arrived from distant families. When asked, Voss would nod solemnly and say that not all blessings could be measured in paper. And still, the children said nothing. They sat quietly at meals, chewed slowly, slept with their hands folded over their chests like corpses rehearsing. Inside his study, Voss kept 3 candles burning at all times, each one dedicated to an orphan he said had been transformed through stillness. His journals from the period, later recovered from beneath the chapel floor, described silence not as absence but as purification. He believed movement interrupted divinity, that true holiness required the body to become still enough for God to listen through it. He was not trying to hurt them, not in his own mind. He believed he was extracting something, narrowing the chaos of their inner lives into something controlled. Each child was a vessel, and silence was the only tool sharp enough to carve the spirit free. He was a kind man, they all said, but even kindness, when wielded by the wrong hands, can become a weapon quieter than screams. It was nearly 40 years after the fire when Sister Imelda spoke the words no one asked for. Her mind had begun slipping, unraveling in slow spirals, but some part of her memory stayed sharp, the part that refused to rot. As her breathing thinned in the charity ward where she'd been wasting away, a young nurse bent close to offer her water, and the old woman turned her face to the wall and whispered, "Room 6 was never for rest." The nurse didn't understand, but when her shift ended, she wrote the words down anyway. That note eventually found its way to a historian reviewing the Saint Arnaud incident, and what followed was a confession so grotesque it was never published in full. But the tapes exist, fragile, hissing with age, full of pauses that feel like the silence between screams. In them, Sister Imelda describes a chamber no one had ever documented, a room never shown in the blueprints or listed in the fire insurance logs. It had no windows, no number on the door, and no handle from the inside. But she called it Room 6. It had been Voss's idea, of course. He claimed the children were too noisy, too tangled in their earthly selves. He said their minds needed to be broken open gently, without violence. The room was his solution, a place of correction through stillness. It was narrow and low, no more than 8 feet by 5, lined with polished copper panels from floor to ceiling. The light came from a small oil lamp behind a grated panel, flickering just enough to catch the children's reflections 100 times over. No shadows, no corners to hide in. The floor was slightly sloped, so any moisture, sweat, urine, tears ran quietly toward a drain in the center. And in the far corner, nailed high on the wall, just out of reach, sat a single egg timer. Large, old, ticking, but always just beyond the child's grasp. Voss never wounded it. Imelda said the children were told to sit in the center and reflect. They were not strapped down. They were simply locked inside with nothing but their breathing, their hunger, and their image staring back at them. The copper was warm to the touch, heated slightly from behind the walls. Just enough to disorient, just enough to keep sleep away. No food was offered, no water. Just silence, interrupted by the soft sound of the timer they could not stop. Some were kept inside for hours, others for days. When they were released, they came out altered. Some trembling, some smiling blankly, most refusing to speak ever again. One boy had clawed at his own eyes. A girl was found humming a tune that didn't exist in any hymnal, her voice toneless, her teeth chipped from grinding. Voss called it spiritual exposure. Said the mirrored walls forced the soul to look back at itself. Said time itself would lose meaning if you could no longer measure it. That was the point of the timer, not to count, but to mock. He said when a child gave up trying to reach it, they were ready to be reshaped. Sister Imelda claimed she objected once. She said she had begged him to stop using it on the younger ones. She wept as she admitted she was punished for that. Made to stand outside the room listening to the dull knocks on the other side, waiting until they stopped. She said she never questioned him again. She had thought she was obeying God by obeying him. But near the end of her confession, she changed her words. She said she knew she had obeyed something, but it wasn't God. And when asked why she never told anyone, she simply said, because the children never left footprints when they came out. To this day, room 6 has never been found. The chapel's substructure collapsed in the fire, and no chamber matching her description appeared in any of the recovered floor plans. But Imelda's voice, weak, cracking, carries one last phrase, barely above a whisper. The room didn't disappear, it just moved into him. The notebook was found tucked behind a loose board beneath the ruins of Voss's former study, sealed in waxed linen, wrapped 3 times in burlap, and buried beneath shattered glass and mouse-bitten hymnals. It was small, no larger than a field journal, its pages discolored by smoke but astonishingly intact. At first glance, it appeared to be a record of spiritual instruction. Pages titled with references to scripture, diagrams labeled in Latin, and marginalia filled with theological phrases. But as the researcher turned each page, the illusion fell apart. What looked like symbols of faith slowly became instruments of control. The sketches were precise, disturbingly elegant. Each one detailed a device, and each device held a singular purpose. Modification of the body under the guise of divine discipline. Voss hadn't just studied pain. He had engineered it. One entry was titled Obedience Through Clarity. The accompanying drawing depicted a blindfold fashioned from thick canvas straps, buckled tightly behind the head. But this was no ordinary cover for the eyes. Embedded in the interior lining were hollow glass nodules positioned to rest directly over the tear ducts. The notes explained that a diluted solution of citrus acid, combined with vinegar and traces of ash, would be administered through a thin copper tube. As the subject began to weep from fear or discomfort, the liquid would flood the ducts, amplifying the pain with each blink. Voss wrote that the intention was not blindness but awakening, a forced cleansing of spiritual impurities through the sting of reflection. The subject was to be left blindfolded until they no longer wept for themselves. Another entry described a crucifix, roughly 8 inches tall, carved from olive wood and fitted with hidden metal seams. At the press of a concealed latch, 6 retractable needles would extend from the base, sharp enough to pierce skin and thin bone. The sketch showed the device placed in the subject's hands during prayer. If their grip wavered, or if they dropped it, the internal spring would trigger. The resulting punctures were described as marks of doubt. Voss believed that physical suffering during prayer allowed the soul to reach its most honest posture. He called it the doctrine of recalibration. These were not tools of punishment. They were rituals in metal and flesh, rituals he believed realigned the child with a higher will. Tucked between the diagrams were notations on individual subjects. Some names matched entries from the scorched ledger. One boy, noted only as FT, had endured a session with the blindfold for 3 hours before collapsing. Voss recorded this as a success. Another child was documented as having resisted the cruciform device with extreme trembling, which Voss attributed to unresolved maternal corruption. That child's name was never recorded again. The notebook did not describe methods of healing. There were no entries on recovery, no concern for the aftermath, only progression, only refinement. It was the mind of a man who had replaced conscience with calculation, who believed that the closer the pain resembled sanctity, the more it became holy. What horrified the researcher most wasn't the cruelty. It was the quiet confidence behind it. The way each sketch was inked with clean lines, each annotation written with measured care. This wasn't madness, it was design, and it wasn't impulsive. It had been planned, improved, perfected over time. Voss didn't view himself as a torturer. He saw himself as a craftsman of salvation, sculpting broken children into obedient vessels. He believed their cries were proof of impurities leaving the body. He believed their disfigurement made them clean. The notebook has never been displayed publicly. It remains in an archival vault, sealed, reviewed only by a small circle of forensic historians and psychological scholars. But among those who've read it, few ever forget the final page. Blank, except for a single phrase written in smudged ink at the center. It reads, "To carve the soul, one must not fear the blade." The deeper they searched, the colder the soil became, as if time itself had frozen beneath the foundations of the St. Arnaud grounds. Near the old chapel ruins stood a stone-ringed well, long dried, sealed decades ago with an iron grate bolted shut from the inside. No one had thought to investigate it until someone matched the dates in Voss's scorched ledger with entries from a smaller leather-bound journal found beside the remains. There were 33 dates, each aligned with a specific hour. Midnight, always during the winter solstice. Voss had marked them with a symbol, a hollow circle with a downward-pointing cross carved through it. The name beside each date corresponded with a child from the orphanage, those same 33 lost names, still unclaimed, still unexplained. At first, the pattern seemed symbolic. But beneath that well, they found proof that ritual had once walked hand in hand with flesh. It took hours to break through the rusted grate. When they finally opened it, what rose from the darkness was not a draft, but an absence, like air that had not been touched in 100 years. A narrow tunnel descended 20 feet before widening into a sealed chamber carved directly into the earth. There was no ladder, no rope, no tools left behind, but the walls were lined with soot, suggesting fire had once burned there. At the chamber's center lay a perfect circle of skulls, 33 arranged in a wheel, each one facing outward, each one missing its lower jaw. The clean precision of the removal, the uniformity of the display left no doubt that this was not accidental nor born of chaos. This had been arranged with care. Some skulls were smaller, still bearing the softness of childhood in the bone curve. Others had markings, carved notations along the crown like tally marks or crude runes. One bore a thin iron spike still lodged through the temple, rust fused with bone. No personal items were found, no fabric, no remnants of burial. Only the skulls, set in silence, surrounded by wax remnants and melted clay bowls once used to hold something that had since been poured out. The journals referred to this ritual only once and vaguely. Voss had written that the soul reaches its narrowest passage at the hour of deepest hunger, when even the bones begin to listen. Some believe he fasted the children for days leading up to the solstice, depriving them of food, light, and speech before leading them beneath the well to perform a purification ceremony he never fully described. Others suspect he believed something darker, that the solstice opened a gate, and the arrangement of jawless skulls allowed the soul to escape without voice, without question, without resistance. No full remains were ever recovered. Only the circle, only the silence. And in the center of the wheel, etched into the packed dirt, was the same symbol from the ledger, circle and cross, scratched again and again until it had dug a hole deeper than reason could follow. When the altar stones were lifted during the final sweep of the chapel foundation, no one expected to find fabric still intact. The earth beneath was thick with lime, tightly packed as if someone had tried to preserve whatever was buried there, not to honor it, but to hide it. A maintenance worker's shovel struck something soft that didn't belong. Folded into itself, wrapped in a page from the Book of Psalms now half-eaten by rot, was a small dress, pale blue, laced at the collar. Carefully stitched initials, MK, faded into the lining. One sleeve had been torn clean off, the hem frayed, but the rest remained eerily preserved in the chemical-soaked soil. The garment was no longer suitable for the living, but it still held weight, as if memory clung to it like a second skin. A forensic team later confirmed it belonged to a child no older than 8. More disturbing was the stain that ran across the chest, a reddish-brown bloom that tested positive for human blood. But the blood told a different story than violence alone. Initial tests found trace elements of arsenic in the fibers. Arsenic wasn't uncommon in the 1800s, used in dyes, pesticides, even medicines. But this wasn't accidental contamination. It had been applied deliberately, in a concentration far too targeted to be environmental. Further analysis uncovered something else. A rare compound of belladonna, deadly nightshade, infused within the lining at the inner waist. Not enough to kill quickly, enough to sedate, enough to confuse, enough to make the world feel like it was flickering between real and imagined. Someone had prepared the dress like a tool, a weapon disguised as clothing. The combination of arsenic and belladonna created a layered effect. First a drifting calm, followed by paralysis, then eventual suffocation if left untreated. And according to Voss's recovered journal entries, this was not just chemistry, it was liturgy. In one entry, he described a concept he called the veil of readiness. He believed that the soul, when properly weakened, would shed its earthly defenses and become momentarily visible, exposed in a state of complete vulnerability. He claimed that suffering alone could be resisted, but when paired with confusion and silence, the soul would begin to unfold. The girl in the dress was never named in the ledger, but the initials matched one of the hidden census records recovered from the diocese. Margaret Kessler, taken in 1874, never adopted, never buried. Her name appeared in no church death logs, but her dress had been placed beneath the altar, pressed under limestone, wrapped in scripture, as if it had been offered. One page of the Psalms that lined the garment bore a singular alteration. Every mention of mercy had been scratched out, replaced with the word cleansing. In Voss's eyes, Margaret had not been lost. She had been prepared, not punished, not discarded, prepared. And the dress, the one she had likely worn to Sunday service, smiling, kneeling, trying to sing in tune, was turned into a container for her final breath. Preserved not to be remembered but to be kept quiet, hidden beneath the feet of worship where no one would think to look. Until someone finally did. He was 92 when he finally spoke of it. The last living tradesman who had entered St. Arnaud before the fire. His name was Lester Curran, a piano tuner by craft, known for his sharp ear and trembling hands. He'd been called in 3 times during the winter of 1875 to adjust the chapel organ, a complex instrument Voss claimed was meant to help children understand harmony through discipline. Lester didn't stay long. He remembered the way the air hung still in the orphanage halls, the unnatural quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the wrong kind. Too thick, too watchful. And he remembered something else, a soundless choir. Not the absence of voices, but the presence of breath held back. It came from behind the wooden partitions near the choir loft, where the children were kept during Mass. Dozens of them lined in rows, dressed in their Sunday robes, mouths unmoving even when the organ played the familiar hymns. Their heads would sway with the music, their eyes lifted toward the ceiling like they could see something in it. Voss had said they were part of a special program trained to sing in their minds alone. But Lester saw the threads, thin, gray, coarse, stretching between the corners of their mouths. He saw the punctures at the lips, the tiny dots of dried blood hidden behind the shadows of candlelight. They were sewn shut. Each child had been stitched with such precision that the seams resembled quiet smiles. Voss called them his mute choir. He believed that true praise came not from sound but from restraint, that the purity of worship was measured in how much pain one could endure without losing the illusion of devotion. He claimed that by suppressing the voice, the soul would learn to hum inwardly, in a frequency only divinity could hear. The children had been trained to sing through their suffering, to sway in rhythm even as their gums swelled and their cheeks burned with infection. There was no rebellion, no cries for help, only motion, only obedience. And then one girl broke. Her name was Altha, though no records remain. She tore her stitching loose one night and fled into the woods surrounding the refuge. When she was found at a neighbor's barn the next morning, her lips were shredded and bleeding, her tongue marked with a strange burn in the shape of an hourglass. She couldn't speak. Her throat had swollen shut, but she tried. She tried until her eyes rolled back and her body seized. 2 days later, she was dead from septic shock. The church buried her quietly, marked her as an invalid taken by fever. The villagers believed it, or at least pretended to. Lester never tuned another organ after that. The hourglass brand matched a carving found on the back of Voss's leather-bound hymnal. Not a symbol of time, but of control, narrow in the middle, wide at both ends. A funnel forcing everything inward. The mute choir had not been an experiment in worship. It was an erasure. One song performed in silence, buried before it could be heard. By 1882, whispers had begun to reach outside the borders of Elmbrook. Too many missing children, too few adoption records. Rumors carried by merchants and passing clergy finally made their way to federal ears, and so they sent an inspector. His name was Everett Langston, a quiet man with sharp observation and a history of exposing corruption in rural institutions. He arrived at St. Arnaud without announcement on a cold February morning, his coat still wet from the train ride. Voss greeted him with open arms, all warmth and humility, as though welcoming an old friend. He offered tea, gave a brief tour, and spoke often of divine progress through discipline. But behind his pleasant tone, Voss was already preparing a show. He knew what men like Langston needed to see: order, cleanliness, and obedient children too frightened to speak the truth. For the next 2 days, Voss curated everything. He selected a handful of children, docile, slow-moving, vacant-eyed, and arranged them in a semicircle within the chapel, dressed in pristine white gowns with hands folded at their laps. They were not allowed to speak. They didn't need to. Every gesture had been rehearsed, their doses calculated. Voss had developed his own blend of sedatives drawn from belladonna, powdered sage, and diluted morphine, administered with sugar cubes pressed against the tongue. The children looked angelic, pale, still, blinking only when they remembered to. Langston took notes quietly, impressed by the discipline, the harmony. He asked for individual interviews, but Voss insisted the children were practicing a vow of silence, part of their spiritual training. Langston hesitated but conceded. On the third morning, Voss prepared a prayer demonstration. The children were arranged at the altar steps, knees on padded boards, heads bowed in synchronization. The organ played low, the same hymn repeated softly beneath the sound of winter wind. Candles flickered. Everything was choreographed. But something went wrong. One child, a girl no older than 10, began shaking. At first it looked like shivering, but her limbs began to stiffen, then spasm violently. She rose onto her knees and turned her face toward Langston. From the corners of her eyes, thin black lines began to run, not tears, but blood. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a dry gasp before she collapsed. Langston stood frozen. Voss rushed to the child, cradling her, calling it a seizure brought on by fasting. He claimed she had always been frail. The inspector demanded a medical file. Voss said she had none. The child was carried away, and Langston's visit ended within the hour. But something had cracked. He returned to Milwaukee and began compiling his report, detailing not just concerns but outright allegations: sedation, malnourishment, possible fatalities. But that report never reached Washington. 1 week later, Everett Langston's body was pulled from a river just outside town, his coat pockets filled with stones, his briefcase missing. The death was ruled accidental drowning. The church offered condolences. The refuge remained open. No children were removed. No records were audited. And Voss, for all his careful choreography, never staged another performance. He didn't need to. The doctrine had been exposed and nothing happened, which only confirmed what he already believed. Silence is stronger than justice and far easier to control. In the final pages of Voss's private journals, those stained, brittle entries that had to be thawed apart from each other like layers of diseased skin, his mind began to slip beyond ritual and into something colder. He no longer referred to the children by name, only by sequence. Subject 15, Subject 16, Subject 17. The language lost its spiritual pretense and turned clinical, mechanical. obsessed with patterns of response and duration of resistance. He no longer spoke of salvation, he began to write about extraction. He had come to believe that every soul was infected from birth, not metaphorically but physically, that what Scripture called original sin was a substance, a sediment lodged deep within the body, coiled in the gut and behind the eyes, and that it could be forced out through what he called reverse baptism. The process required 3 stages: starvation to weaken the flesh, silence to empty the mind, and then auditory flooding, a deliberate overload of sound designed to shatter the final defenses of identity. The last chamber discovered beneath the western wing of the chapel was unlike any other room on the grounds. It had no door. Only a narrow vertical hatch like an old dumbwaiter led down into it. When the fire had devoured the main building, this part of the stonework had survived, sealed off by a collapsed stairwell. The room measured 10 feet across, circular, with no windows or furnishings. The walls, floor, and ceiling had all been painted, every inch covered with distorted human mouths. Some open wide, some stitched, some screaming in silence. Dozens of shades of red, brown, and black swirled into each other, forming layers so thick the brushstrokes still looked wet under flashlight. A single iron post stood in the center, fitted with a rusted belt and wrist restraints. The chain links were embedded into the base of the floor, as if whatever had been bound there wasn't meant to move even an inch. Dried wax ringed the perimeter in jagged intervals, blackened by time and heat, but intact. In one of the journal's last entries, Voss wrote about a breakthrough. He claimed Subject 31 had reached total opening after 7 days without food, 4 without sleep, and 57 minutes of constant exposure to a custom auditory loop, an unholy mix of reversed hymns, distorted animal cries, and a recording made from dragging a nail across an empty slate. He believed the child had entered a state where their breath became something else. He described it as the moment the vessel screams without a voice. No records exist of what happened to Subject 31, only a date circled 3 times, December 21st, 1884. The solstice. The same night recorded beside the last name in the ledger. No remains were found in that chamber. No bones, no fabric. Only claw marks beneath one of the painted mouths, and a section of wall where the mouths had been scraped away by hand, as though something inside had tried to erase the sound it could no longer stop hearing. It was never meant to be found. The names in the scorched ledger were written to disappear, recorded in a hand that knew how to make erasure look like care. But records don't forget, not all of them. In a brittle basement archive of the Milwaukee Diocese, behind rows of misfiled baptism certificates and funeral notices, a retired librarian named Corinne Mallory uncovered a series of mismatched census addendums from the early 1870s to 1885. She had not been looking for ghosts. She had been cataloging microfilm. But tucked between census logs was a thin, unsorted packet labeled only Saint. Arno Transitional Youth Relocation Roster. It listed 33 children by first name, each marked as relocated with no destination, no forwarding records, no signatures of receipt. Every one of them vanished between the months of November and February over a span of 13 years. The birth years matched the ages recorded beside the names in the ledger. So did the years of disappearance. The correlation was impossible to ignore. These were not symbols. These were children. and they had been buried not in the ground but in paperwork designed to vanish them quietly. The discovery made its way to a university history department where it fell into the hands of Dr. Clara Vell, a professor of post-war religious institutions. She had spent years researching orphaned populations displaced after the Civil War. But what pulled her into this case was something far more personal. Her great-grandmother's name, Annalise, appeared on the relocation roster. Clara had grown up hearing whispers of a child who was taken in by the church and never returned. A family shame, spoken of rarely and only in bitter tones. She had assumed it was exaggeration, a relic of old grudges. But now there it was, ink on paper, dated February 1878, a name with no exit path, no confirmation of arrival, just relocated, like freight. Driven by a mix of outrage and professional instinct, Clara began piecing together every fragment she could. She obtained sealed church documents, corresponded with state records offices, and filed FOIA requests for the original inspection logs from the 1882 federal visit. What she found was a web of silence, a pattern of administrative dead ends, documents lost to fire, inconsistencies in the logs that appeared only when certain names were involved. It wasn't just disappearance, it was removal, surgical, cold. Someone had gone to enormous lengths to make sure these children did not exist beyond that place, and someone else had counted on time to finish the job. Clara presented her findings at a closed academic panel in 1997. The room was quiet when she read each of the 33 names aloud. There were no surnames for most, just first names, ages, and disappearance years. But the way she said them gave them weight, as if she were digging them up syllable by syllable. She displayed census logs, hand-scanned pages from the scorched ledger, the photograph of the hourglass brand found on the tongue of the mute choir girl. She showed the side-by-side of Voss's handwritten prayer alterations and the alterations to the Psalms wrapped around Margaret's dress. She showed the symbol, a circle with a cross, etched into the chamber under the well and again on the final journal page. She ended with a simple question. If this wasn't a ritual, then what was it? No one answered. Later that year, Clara's report was published in an obscure historical review, where it might have faded like so many disturbing truths do. But a local journalist picked it up, then a national publication. The story of the 33 forgotten children spread across quiet corners of the country, raising uncomfortable questions about church oversight, about silence as complicity, about the nature of evil when dressed in robes. The church issued a public response that acknowledged past irregularities and promised to review archival policies for transparency. No direct apology was given, no reparations were offered, but they did something unusual. Without warning or fanfare, the Diocese of Milwaukee erected a small plaque on the grounds where the chapel once stood. It bore no names, no explanations, only a Latin inscription. Non est oblitus. Not forgotten. Clara returned to Elmbrook once. She didn't stay long. She stood at the edge of the woods where the refuge had once cast its shadow, holding the names in her hand. She wasn't interested in forgiveness. She didn't want resolution. What she wanted was remembrance, the kind that didn't ask for comfort, the kind that made silence louder. She believed that somewhere in the soil echoes of those children remained, not just in bone or ash, but in breath that had never been allowed to finish. And though the church might never speak their names aloud, Clara had, one by one, slowly, in rooms that used to be quiet. The land had been quiet for decades, just a skeletal clearing surrounded by woods that never quite regrew right, where wind moved oddly and animals seldom lingered. Locals avoided it even long after the fire, even after the church sold off the surrounding acres to lumber companies and no buyers came. The ground where Saint Arnaud once stood remained untouched, sunken in the middle like a chest that had forgotten how to rise. But when the 33 names finally surfaced, when the ledger, the relics, and the horror were exposed beyond quiet footnotes and sealed archives, the town of Elmbrook could no longer pretend not to remember. They called it a reckoning, quiet and delayed. But it came. By the turn of the millennium, a modest monument was commissioned. Nothing grand, nothing loud. A single marble column carved from Wisconsin limestone, placed precisely where the chapel's threshold had once been. Around it, a circle of stones bore no words, only 33 small etchings, one for each child whose name had once been meant to vanish. The town gathered for its unveiling on the coldest evening of the year. Candles were passed out in silence. Families, clergy, and strangers stood shoulder to shoulder as the sun fell and the wind bit through coats. It wasn't a ceremony of closure. There were no hymns, no sermons. Only breath, hanging visible in the dark. As if that space still required silence before it would allow anything louder. But the earth had one final truth to give back. It happened at the edge of the vigil after most of the crowd had gone. A maintenance crew clearing the last of the perimeter rubble struck something solid beneath the surface, near what had once been the southwest wing of the dormitories. They assumed it was a root cellar, an old storage vault missed by earlier surveys. But the cement slab covering it had been poured after the original building burned, suggesting someone sealed it not out of neglect, but intention. Once broken open, the space beneath revealed a narrow stairwell leading down to a chamber untouched by light or memory. What they found was not storage. It was a grave of artifacts that spoke more clearly than any voice ever had. The walls were lined with hundreds of child-sized shoes arranged in rows along wooden planks, the soles all facing inward. In one corner, what first appeared to be ropes turned out to be braids. Bundles of hair preserved in waxed linen tied neatly with thread. They ranged in color and length, but all were too small for adults. Some were labeled with parchment tags now crumbling, marked with only numbers. There were no bones, no bodies, only evidence of preparation, of ritual removal, as if the physical parts had been claimed while the rest had been filed away under doctrine. In the far end of the cellar, directly opposite the stairs, stood a smooth stone wall, its surface blackened by soot and age. Carved deep into its center, untouched by time or weather, was the hourglass symbol, vertical, symmetrical, sharp. Beneath it, in nearly invisible etching, the same Latin phrase found in the scorched ledger appeared again. Silentia per lumen. Silence through light. Investigators cataloged the chamber's contents under a new case designation, separate from the Saint Arnaud fire, separate from the disappearance of the children. Officially, it was recorded as an unclassified ritual site of unknown purpose. The church made no statement. No clergy returned to Elmbrook after the cellar's discovery. The monument remained untouched, but candlelight vigils ceased. The town didn't gather again. Some say the land finally breathed after that night. Others believe it only held its breath deeper. Legacy is not always built in memory. Sometimes it is buried in avoidance, in the quiet decisions of people who look away at the right time. Father Emil Voss never faced trial, never faced a congregation demanding answers. His name is not on any official list of sanctioned clergy. His journals remain in climate-controlled storage, sealed under agreements that keep them from the public. But his doctrine, the belief that obedience is worth more than pain, that silence is more holy than truth, left an imprint, not just in the ground, not just in the children, but in the institutions that allowed it to go on year after year, unchecked behind walls built in the name of care. There is no justice for the 33. There is only the absence where they should have stood. Their names were not spoken during the vigil. The town chose not to read them aloud, fearing it would invite something back. But one historian did. A week after the cellar was found, she returned to the site alone. She stood by the monument, held the printed list to her chest, and whispered each name into the cold air. She said them for no audience. She said them not to summon, but to release. She said them because they had once been taken in silence, and silence was never meant to be their last word. What do you think? Could this happen again? Or does it still happen, just behind different doors? Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears kindness. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it kneels beside a child and asks them to sing. And sometimes it builds its walls so carefully that no one notices they're made of screams.